Okay, we're going to go ahead and actually start this last panel, which will be a roundtable discussion. I think that will allow people to actually articulate a number of the ideas that have been percolating in their heads since the beginning of today. I first wanted to actually thank NIDA with the Woodrow Wilson Center for having the foresight to pull together a conference that actually focuses on the dominant themes of multiculturalism. For those of you who haven't been here the entire day, over the day we've actually focused on what multiculturalism is and what it isn't. Attitudes actually related to multiculturalism and the origin of these attitudes. So issues such as immigration, national identity, failing economies, etc. We've also focused on policies and initiatives related to multiculturalism, ranging from integration and border controls to discrimination in Islamic banking. We've also talked about the population that make up Europe's multicultural communities, from citizens with Roma, Muslim, African, and other backgrounds to migrants and refugees with diverse backgrounds. So today's roundtable is actually an opportunity to synthesize the issues discussed today and also to have a somewhat forward-looking discussion on whether the current policy focus on multicultural issues is where it actually should be. So I'm very pleased today to have with me immediately to my right Uffe Jensen, who's part of the European Union's delegation to Washington. He's originally from Denmark. To his actual, I said right, to the left, to his actual left is Dimitrios Papadimitriou, who I'm just going to call Dimitri for the rest of the day. And then he's actually the president of the Migration Policy Institute. And then we also have at the very end Jonathan Birdwell, who's joining us all the way from the UK. He's the head of the citizen program of Demos, and we're just really thankful that he's still with us this late in the afternoon after having made such a long flight. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm actually Misha Thompson. I'm with the U.S. Helsinki Commission. We're an independent U.S. agency that monitors European and North American countries' compliance with the Organization for Security and Cooperation commitments, or the short term for that is actually the OSCE. And this includes in areas of human rights, economy, and security. And so with that, because this is really going to be the session where you all also get a chance to talk a little bit more, I actually just wanted to start with a general question for the panel. And that is, why are we talking about multiculturalism now, and should we be? You know, is it simply because Angela Merkel, Nicolas Sarkozy, David Cameron actually made statements about this issue? Or are these conversations actually something that are really important to Europe long-term in the transatlantic relationship? I mean, we just as easily today could be talking about the Eurozone, enlargement, NATO, a number of other discussions that are taking place. But really just wanted to kick off with that question. And I'll actually start with Dimitri and Jonathan, just to mix it up a little bit, and because I knew you'd think he'd go first.
Hi, everyone. I apologize for not having been here the rest of the day. But you know how it is. And I don't promise to tell the truth despite the best efforts of the Wilson Center to put us, under these heavy-duty lights. Why are we talking about multiculturalism? Well, in some ways we're talking about it because of the reasons that Misha said. It has become the bête noire, in the conversation about, how basically we organize our societies. Another reason, probably equally valid, is because there are some elements of multiculturalism that are very useful in sort of organizing how multi-ethnic societies, which is what all of us societies have now become, all of the Europeans, not all of them, but the vast majority of them, and of course North America, let alone, of course, New Zealand and Australia. In other words, countries that have, through national decisions and national models, have found a way to organize themselves in order to accommodate and meet those kinds of things that I heard in the last few minutes, inclusion, and, essentially making sure that people have rights that they can practice, etc., etc. And there is an awful lot of value to multiculturalism. And let me sort of discuss first, however, different types of multiculturalism. We all know, and we had a representative, I believe, in the last panel from the Netherlands, that, again, if you were to take a very broad brush, something that the model that the Dutch followed, roughly from the late 1970s to sometime, I don't know, around 2000. I don't know when things started to break down. Things typically begin to break down well before they become political issues, and you have ministers who play games with these issues. So, when Verdonk, the minister who actually, sort of tried to take things apart, and very aggressively so, was a minister in 2003, 2004, 2005. But clearly, unhappiness was building a political, the political consensus about these things, had broken down. And as it happens with politicians, the smart politicians, I didn't say the good politicians, but the smart politicians who often are very successful, know how to take advantage, of an issue like unhappiness, in other words, on the part of the people, to sort of fuel this unhappiness and then exploit the issue for political advantage. And Rita was particularly good at that, Rita Verdonk. It always mystifies me, although I have an explanation, I don't know if you care to hear it, that Merkel, decided to say the thing that it said. But if you read it in context, and if you think of the climate at the time that she was talking about, the fact that the CSU, has been sort of the aggressive partner on this issue to the CDU, and when you consider the fact that she was talking to the youth wing of the party that is the most activist part tends to be the CSU, taken on multiculti, without having to explain what that means, was probably a convenient thing for her to do. That's fine. The Brits, and here you have to sort of, in each one of these cases, you have to look back to the history, the evolution of these issues. You have to think back to the 1950s and 1960s, and Powell, in 1968, and the rivers of blood, and all these other kinds of nonsense. But what all these things led to was indeed this concept that, of course, was called racial equality, that in some ways you can interpret as multiculturalism, as separate societies, et cetera, So, when the Prime Minister of the UK made his speech once or twice, I think he has done so with multiculturalism, he was trying to basically make a political point primarily aimed at the Muslim communities. So there is a national context in which these arguments happen. Multiculturalism as a legal, and in this instance constitutional, concept only exists in one country. I'll be willing to entertain an argument that there is 1.5 countries, and that is Canada. And again, you have to go back to look at how that concept came about. Canada never set out to develop multiculturalism. It set out to try to save the Union, as it were, to make sure that, that Canada, French Canada, and English Canada were not going, to sort of come apart. And back in the late 60s, Trudeau passed some legislation that gave certain rights to Quebec, of course, coming out of language rights. And at the same time, did that in order to keep the Union together. Those rights were sort of strengthened in the 1970s. And when what the Canadians called the repatriated, or the repatriation of the Constitution in 1982, which simply means still belonging to the Commonwealth, but having a constitution, because they never had a constitution, that was enshrined into the Constitution. And, these kinds of things, once you open the door for a specific group, other groups sort of walk through. And since Canada has decided to sort of continue to grow at a dizzying pace with regard to immigration, the numbers are simply stunning, all of those rights that initially started with special rights for the French have now been extended for the last 20-some years to all of the other ethnic groups and national groups in Canada.
Yeah.
Now, and I'll finish on us, with us, because either we or the Australians are the other half. And take your choice. The Australians experimented with formal multiculturalism in the 1990s. And then, conservative governments took over about 1996, 1997, and they sort of tried to pull back. So you could say that multiculturalism, sort of exists there. But the case in which multiculturalism exists de facto on the ground is this place here. We don't call it that. We don't have a name for it at all. And it goes back, of course, to the 1960s, the civil rights legislation, all of these wonderful things that we did then, which expanded opportunities and curtailed the power of whatever the uglies or even the state in some instances from making distinctions across groups. The anti-discrimination legislation, the Fair Housing Act, et cetera, et cetera. So it's still a way for, perhaps analysts to sort of catalog things. It exists, in pure form in only one place. Some other places sort of tend toward multiculturalism, if you will. But all of us are trying to struggle with finding sort of the perfect mix of policies between group rights and the rights of the state and individual rights, etc. The solution or whatever, the way that individual states will do it in the end will be, as I said in the very beginning of this, a national solution.
Now, you actually identified about 4 or 5 different issues that I know we need to talk to, but one of the threads that I actually wanted to pick up on was this idea of multiculturalism initially being introduced as a political issue, and this possible relation to votes, and in a sense that's why you had very senior political leaders actually even talking about multiculturalism. And so linked to that, I actually wanted to have Jonathan talk a little bit about how this idea of multiculturalism has actually played to different sets of voters. And I know you've done a lot of research on populist far-right groups, and if you could also talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Thank you very much. I just want to say, while I am coming from London, and I work in London, I'm actually American, so if you're wondering why I have such a strange accent, it's not because I'm putting on any kind of affectation. It's just an example of how I'm trying to integrate into my new society. So I'm going to answer that question, but then also kind of go to your original question. And I've been working with Jamie as well on, I work at the think tank Demos. We were doing this project on the rise of kind of anti-immigrant populist groups across Europe. And really that's why we're here, is because, over the past 10 years at least, we've seen a rise of these groups, not only political parties who have gained, power and become junior partners in coalition governments across Europe, but also the emergence of these very strange kind of street-based movements, the English Defence League, the Bloc Identitaire in France. And, obviously something is going on here. And a lot of people, and I think this is what the major politicians are responding to, is that something's moving people to go out. They're upset. And actually you can potentially measure the success of these groups, not necessarily in their own electoral success, but in the success that they have in influencing the rhetoric of mainstream parties. So clearly there is an issue there. And, while a lot of it is due to kind of selection bias based on the media focusing on the kind of negative aspects, those negative aspects exist, especially in the UK. I don't know if you were here for the first presentation from the German Marshall Fund. Perceptions around immigration, particularly in the UK, are very negative. Certain communities in the Northwest are highly segregated. They're parallel communities. And this is causing a lot of friction. And what we would argue, I think, at Demos, and our director especially, David Goodhart, who's trying to develop this notion of post-liberalism, that, we need to go further. The kind of multiculturalism policies that Ahmed was talking about, those are great. But we need to also try to define some kind of common experience, some kind of common national identity. And that's not participating in these kind of interminable debates about what does it mean to be British or what does it mean to be French, but it simply means, we would argue, that you need to start trying to increase interactions between people, day-to-day interactions. And I'm not talking about kind of interfaith, intercommunity dialogues that are set up solely for the purpose of bringing different communities together, but rather maximizing kind of day-to-day interactions in pursuit of a commonly shared goal. So how do you do that? Well, I think a lot of governments have made good first steps in focusing on language. If you can't speak to your neighbor, then you're not going to understand them. The only kind of perception or the only understanding that you're going to have about them is going to come through, the media that is, obviously hyperbolic and, just as trying to chase kind of ridiculous headlines. Second, I think, so it's language. It's also focusing on the segregation that happens. Obviously, when new immigrants come to communities, they go to where they know people, where there's already friendly networks. And then often, as they kind of, progress socioeconomically, it becomes more diffuse. But what we've seen in the UK is this kind of entrenchment. So it's less about the communities that are already there, but about new immigrants. How can we try and foster policies that kind of reduce that spatial segregation? And I think it is more important in terms of Europe because we have higher population density in Europe. And also the welfare states, obviously. So there's a greater need for trying to create a greater sense of commonality. And then the last thing I'll say is we did some research, and it's not about kind of conflicting identities. Well, our research, not the stuff Jamie and I, but another colleague has done, which is looking at patriotism in the UK. And actually what we found was that British Muslims were the most proud of being British. So it's not that there are competing identities. And actually the people who were most proud of being, they were most patriotic were those who were volunteering in their local communities, who were out there and meeting other people. So, one recommendation we made off the back of that was instead of these kind of very strange, arcane citizenship tests that ask you very, strange historical questions about what happened in, 1600, instead, why don't you just make a requirement for new want-to-be citizens to actually go and volunteer in different communities? And that hope to get them to kind of break down the barriers and to start kind of interacting, because that's what we think is required. So I'll say that.
Well, thank you. I think you actually articulated a number of the policies that have been under consideration. We're very, I think, lucky to have Ufa here today to actually talk about the policies that are currently being considered by the European Union, as well as their implementation. And what I will say is that he actually unpacked maybe a laundry list of things ranging from immigration and Muslims and migrants, all the way to policies around actual social integration. And was hoping you could offer maybe a snapshot of what policies you actually see, I would say maybe at the top of the list at this point that the European Union is working on, and talk maybe a little bit about your work.
Thanks a lot, Misha, and thanks for the invitation. It has been really a rich debate this morning. I'm not sure I can fulfill all your requirements of explaining the EU's policies and policy development in this case. But if you allow me to step one step back and just say that whatever we have said today, me being EU official for 20 years now, like the rest of the guys in Brussels, we have totally lost any kind of link to reality. So we still believe in diversity. You'll see that the policies we are coming up with these days are still about more integration. On the migration issue, we have linked migration politics and legislation with some kind of guidelines on how member states could do a better integration as well. It's not our basic mandate to do so, but at least we'll address that issue as well. So basically, yes, we believe in unity and diversity. It was an old slogan we had many years ago, which I guess links back to multicultural theories. Somebody changed that recently to United in Diversity, and I don't know why it was changed. But as I said, we didn't really change our minds back home. We are still promoting a lot of freedoms, free movements of persons. We are engaging with third countries on migration and visa regimes. We don't give up. We continue. Now, the overarching motivation for that one, that's a tricky one as well. We could start to talk about democracy, and you said that it might be, Jonathan said it might be difficult to promote multicultural ideas if you have to speak to voters. Now, luckily, the EU, the commissioners are not democratically elected directly, so we have a democratic deficit. So we still have the freedom and the luxury to still believe in the good cause of diversity. So yes, we are dealing with that one. So no, back to the more what we're looking into. We are, of course, as we cannot hide these days, we are in a kind of economic crisis, but the economic rationale behind our policies, they go in the direction of bigger markets. I mean, the whole internal market and the freedoms I was talking about for free movement of persons, of goods, services, and capital. They logically follows that we need to make a better framework for people as well when they move. The enlargement of Big 10 and plus 2 new member states also speak in that direction. The EU neighborhood policy or interest in these areas are something we are concerned about. When we made the Lisbon agenda some years ago, it was about making EU to the most competitive economy in the world, which means that with a demographic development where we are losing out, our generations or population gets older and older. So we need actually to get fresh blood into the European Union. So our policies are also reflecting this one, and these are long-term goals. It's not something that we forget it because we have a crisis of 1 year, 2 years, 3 years if we are unlucky. It will come back again. We'll need mobility, and we are true believers of mobility.
Can you actually talk a little bit about what Europe's migration needs are, where they're looking for them, who they're looking for, and in a sense, I guess, how this gels with the current unemployment rate in a number of places?
I want to make some promotion for ourselves because we're not very good at that actually. But I've been in America for 1 year, and I've seen how you have been struggling with the migration policy. And our migration policy, at least on paper level, on policy level, it's quite advanced and refined, comprehensive. Implementation might be something different because this is not EU competence per se only, it's also member state competences. But still we have made what we call the global approach to migration and mobility, which is something we publicized last November. It's an update of a previous one, which links our migration policy to the external policy as well after Lisbon. It also focuses more on the human rights or the fundamental rights of the migrant itself. So we have actually managed to make a comprehensive policy document. Now coming to the more core of your question, what kind of migrants do we want to have? I don't know, but I mean, basically we have copied the green card. We call it the blue card, of course. So we're trying to attract high-skilled labor because we have been looking to the United States for many years, a bit jealous about how you could attract a lot of high-skilled migrants in high in the sectors of IT, etc. So we would like to do something like that. So we have facilitated that one. We want to make it easier for students and research people. So we want to upgrade our directives on this one. These are still under discussion between the Commission, the Parliament, and the Council. And we also look into intercorporate migration, so that if you have a company in India or in the United States, it should be easier for the skilled labor to come in.
Actually, I have several questions, but I actually saw Jonathan down there nodding and wasn't sure if you wanted to jump in on one of the points. Oh, okay. So, actually, I have several questions, but we're already at the 2:45 mark and running a little bit late. So I'll actually open it up to the audience, and if I don't see any hands, then I'll start asking my questions. So we'll start here to the right. Oh, sir. Here. Oh, actually, I was.
Bernd Frede of the German Lutheran Church in Washington, D.C. I want to thank you very much for putting up this event. I think it's in the spirit of the person who gave this institution the name of President Wilson. Now, it again for me shows that only from the distance you can see sometimes things clearer in where you come from. So I learned a lot about the European Union and Germany. And I would like to give an answer to the question, why is multiculturalism an important issue for us? I was born in 47, and I asked my parents where they were and what they did between 1933 and 1945. And I would argue that the question of how we get along in this whole issue of multiculturalism has the same weight for our country and for Europe. And my grandchildren, if I ever have some, will ask me what I have been doing during this period of time. We have been today looking at the deficits, and I'm glad that at the end of the day we hear a few things where we should go or where we can go. When I do a sermon, I also like to identify deficits, but I do not want to leave the congregation on that note. So my question would be, von Kanada lernen heißt siegen lernen. Do we have to learn from the Canadians how to do it in Europe? Maybe we can dwell a little bit more on these questions. Where do we go from here after we have heard so many of the problems?
We'll actually take one more.
Mine is a comment which I really liked. Jonathan's very concrete suggestions, and I just wanted to add a few things and see if that makes any sense for the panelists. It seems like the concept of contribution should be central from all the suggestions that you have put together, Jonathan. I think it seems the idea of the minority or the immigrant to contribute to the larger society. And in that vein, I want to just add that the role of grassroots organizations could be a best collaborator, to accomplish those goals. So I think the role of civil society organizations, grassroots organizations, seems to be very important. Second point, in education, in my view, from the Dutch case, and here's a very negative thing that I see happening in the Netherlands, and that's the segregation, de facto segregation, that's happening in the schools. In the Netherlands, the term zwarte scholen is now placed. That is literally meaning black schools. Not that there are actually students from, let's say, African origin in these schools, but these kids are of Moroccan or Turkish origin. But they're called zwarte scholen, just to identify. So other than busing, I don't see any solution. That seems to be very... and then there is an experience, of course, of that in this country. So maybe panelists can evaluate whether that really works or not. And lastly... despite the warnings of my other colleague here right after my talk about the role of making more money, I will still say that the rise of middle class could actually break this equation between poverty, ethnicity, and religion. And that seems to be a very difficult one that creates a lot of social discrimination.
Okay, we'll actually have the panel respond, and then we'll go for another round of questions. Is there anyone that would like to go first?
Sure, I'll go. So in terms of Canada, what can we learn from Europe? Well, I just feel like people often kind of hold up Canada as this kind of shining light. And actually, I'm not so sure it is. I mean, it probably is more so than other countries, but, we did some research around Al-Qaeda-inspired and, like, extremism, homegrown extremism in Canada, and a lot of what we saw there were, the issues around kind of Sharia in family-based arbitration tribunals. You know, there's a huge amount, and you also saw kind of public opinion beginning to turn against just what kind of accommodations do we make to new arriving immigrants. So, I mean, to just constantly hold up Canada, I think, as, you know, as I said, this kind of beacon isn't quite right. And I think you do have to look, I mean, obviously, though, Canada is a huge country again, and you have to consider the high population density in Europe. I mean, that's really significant. In terms of contribution, I should have said as well, I meant to, it's down in my notes, but I should have stressed, it's not just about the contribution from minorities. In terms of going further, I think we also have to, you know, really stress to host communities that things aren't going to change. And, you know, we have to kind of go forward and accept that, you know, national identity, we're moving forward together. We have to accept this kind of diversity. But in terms of the contribution, yes, absolutely, grassroots organizations, I'm sure, can play a huge role in that. As I said, in the context of, you know, working together across different communities towards a common goal. I think that's really important. It's not just coming together to learn about things. It's almost doing it on the sly, right? You know, working towards some other common goal. And in terms of education, just want to give this example. In the UK, this government has launched what they call the National Citizen Service. And I'm quite interested in these ideas. Now, this National Citizen Service in the UK, it's basically a 4-week program, which is obviously not long enough. It happens at 16. Once in the UK, you leave school at 16, then go to further education college. And the ambition is for every single 16-year-old to take part in this program. And the primary objective, according to the government, is social mixing. Right? So they want people to mix together at this young age to try and break down these barriers. And I think that holds a possibility, but obviously 4 weeks is way too short, and the extent to which they can actually roll this out to the entire 16-year-old cohort, which is about 800,000 young people, is obviously questionable.
Dimitri?
I'm trying to think of how you can possibly reduce all recommendations down to one. And I will do so. It's a dangerous game. Non-discrimination. Not just in the books, which Europe now has put in the books, but aggressively enforcing it. Okay? Very few countries in the EU, despite the EU directive on this, despite the fact that you have an anti-discrimination agency, etc., you have to get that down into the sort of weave it into the makeup of people, policymakers and politicians, and make them actually mean it. You can't wait for the European courts 3 years and 45,000 moons later, you know, coming up with a decision and then wait, you know, for another 3 years for that decision to be incorporated, you know, into the legal bodies of the member states. You know, the problem that we face with moving forward with some of these legislative initiatives is enforcement, or I should say lack of enforcement. There is this almost passive way in which many of these things become incorporated into legal systems, but there is no oomph in the way that these things, you know, are moving forward. If I can tell you how many times I've heard ministers and other very senior people say, do you want me to actually go to the level of this particular whatever, you know, storekeeper and tell him that he or she has to actually hire a Moroccan, you know, a this, a that? And I say, yes, that's what the law says. Or German politicians at the highest levels actually say to me, just a couple of years ago, do you know what would happen if a Turkish policeman, in other words, this was in response to a conversation about whether the Beamte class should be opened to people of, what do you guys call it, a migration background, you know, all these new terms, you know, neologisms that kill me. Can you imagine what would happen? I said, what would happen? He would be enforcing the law, and the German who broke that law should go to jail. And he looked at me as if I came from Mars. So if we do one thing in Europe in order to get to where it is that you, over time, that you are trying to get, we need to really mean what we say. And the only way that you can mean what you say is by enforcing. There could be there are other answers, but you forced us to look at one of them. On the issues of segregation in schools, and I've heard, right, you're somewhere there, I know. You're blocked by others, but that's, you don't need to. And I've heard that expression all too often, in Rotterdam and The Hague in particular. And my answer to that is the answer that you gave a few minutes ago, half an hour ago, when somebody asked from here whether pillarization is the answer. Okay? For me, I'm sorry, I'm old enough to be direct. The stupidest thing that anybody can do is simply import something or import something from somebody else and try to put it down in another country. Context matters. There are at least 2 or 3 steps before you actually begin to borrow ideas. First, I'm sorry, I'm not talking down to you. You know this, but I need to answer that question, okay? First, you have to understand it in the context, the political and the social context in which the idea was generated, understand whether it succeeded or failed, how and why. Then you need to abstract it out. Take the core of the idea. Bring it to the Netherlands or somewhere else and say, okay, this sounds like an interesting idea, challenging but interesting. What would be the equivalent of a Dutch solution to busing, for instance, or any other thing? And if you can indigenize it, adapt it, okay, then you can test it. You know, one of the things that Europeans do particularly badly, and we've done it particularly badly in our history. It's not that, you know, these are not the paragons. This is not, Washington is not a place that has any paragons, okay? Is that we basically try to come up with things that at the end of the day, we somehow know that they won't work, which then makes all of the academics so very happy because you can write another article and talk about the unintended consequences, okay? You know, let me assure you, from the policy end of this, there is no such thing as an unintended consequence. They choose to ignore it in passing legislation that doesn't make sense, rather that they somehow would be surprised if things went the opposite direction. These are all perverse effects that are totally predictable. So I would urge, you know, policymakers not to simply copy from anybody else. You remember some of the development literature in the 1960s, which tells you what my age is. You know, the compulsion to copy. You may recall that, you know, that somehow, you know, we're going to take something that worked in whatever, in China, and import it into Ethiopia, and then everything will work out. It doesn't. Finally, on the issue of, you know, the idea of common purpose. You know, you use another word. It's an idea, I mean, have conversations with people. Maybe the Canadians are not, you know, anything. But it is the only government that I know of, and I know every government and how they do their immigration policy, and its history, that constantly talks to its people. Constantly, all the time. All the other governments wait for things to go to hell, explode, people having a conversation in the media, which of course is never helpful, and then they parachute in and they say often something very stupid. The whole idea is engage your people, engage your social institutions, your NGO community, the different levels of government in an ongoing conversation about what to do on issues of immigration, or for that matter, issues of, you know, inclusion, et cetera, This way you can fix and have the ability, and that includes legislative authority, to actually change what you're doing without having to wait for the U.S. Congress, which, as Ufa said, you know, he didn't mention he's too kind and he's a foreign policy official. He wouldn't say, you know, those idiots up there. I'm sorry, Mr. Wilson, who are you? You don't have to wait for them to agree on whether today is Thursday or Friday or any other day of the week. In other words, the ability to adapt, the feedback loop is essential in all of this in order to deliver a better program, better ideas, better legislation, and administer it better next time around. And next time around shouldn't wait 5 years.
Questions? Okay. I'll take one in the back. Just because you're also from Greece now. So we'll start here.
Hi, thanks. First and foremost, I have really enjoyed the panel today. All the panels have been in and out. I wanted to make a comment and then a question. Just to give you a little bit of background, I grew up in Sweden. I am not Swedish. I'm Eritrean, came there as a refugee, grew up very much Swedish in the sense of my language, my cultural backgrounds, you know, bits and pieces that you put together to make a whole person. One of the things that I really agree with is the sense of nationalism and national identity. And when I hear about multiculturalism, really in my mind, what I think about is that on the one hand, you have this push to integrate. And then on the other hand, you have this, you know, expansion of this national identity that actually has to happen for the two to be able to tango. So, and what I have seen in my own experience is that there's this real resistance to actually wanting to expand this national identity. So the gentleman, Jonathan Birdwell, for instance, said, you know, let's not talk about what it really means to be British. No, I think that that is really at the heart of this, because what does it mean to be British in the 21st century needs to think about ways to expand what it used to mean to what it means today. So for an immigrant who outside of England would very much be identified as a British and also be British as one of their identities. This is getting a bit complex, but I think you get what I'm saying, is that there's also this need for the receiving population to have to expand their idea or their identity of what it means to be themselves and what it means to be British as it's being projected out into the world. So if you could speak a little bit to that and the willingness of this actually maybe coming to some sort of fruition if you see it in the future.
So basically, I completely agree with this, and I tried to bring it up in my presentation, but I think I might have failed. I think we should get more answers, and to answer the pastor's question earlier, nation states in Europe, where we shouldn't forget, for decades, over decades, if not centuries in some cases, have been trying to impart national identities in their population so they can sustain their borders or expand them and fight wars against evil people in their view and so on and so forth. But now we're basically, in our group here, is trying to understand how can we get from where we were for other reasons to a new place, right? And the European Union was one attempt to do that and create a supranational identity, kind of going back to your question also, subside a little bit, put down those national things. But we see that this is not happening without unintended consequences, let's say, to follow Dimitri's point. So in that sense, I completely agree. The question is, can anyone do anything about this? Because the European Union cannot tell national governments, as you will tell us, how to think of themselves, because many people resist. Whenever I talk to European Union diplomats, actually, it saddens me that they refused to think of the United States of Europe anymore. I thought that was part of the vision, but it seems that no longer is accepted. Everybody's talking about the European Union as an international, an interstate organization. So basically, what are the alternatives for something like what was suggested to happen if in the domestic level we have this debate not in the view of expanding the definition of the nation, but rather keeping it steady or even constraining it or making it more restrictive? And if the Europeans and the European Union is not going to have that vision of supranational identity anymore, or a federal view, let's say, where will this change come from? From violence in the streets, or what? So, sorry to be so long, but
I don't know if I can answer your question, and I'm saddened that you're saddened speaking to me and my colleagues. I think actually, it's a bit an artificial debate in my view, because we don't need to speak about a federal state or not in the view of the Brussels bureaucracy, and I believe also you cannot avoid to get to a new place. I think the world is in movement. The perception by the population, the younger generation. I'm Danish. I've just seen the new election result back home. Is a total rejection of the xenophobic agenda which you saw before. I think this whole thing moves. The European Union has a lot of programs. I mean, take an example as the Bologna process, whereby we advocate for students to take some of the curricula in universities of other places. We have different programs for that, and we have to have mutual recognition. So there's a long way to go, but we are always moving on the cultural front as well. But that's a bit difficult, because the cultural front, like the front of Home Affairs and Justice, is something which is very core to national identity. At the same time, I mean, being in Brussels so many years, I don't see a conflict between having a stronger Swedish identity and an additional European identity, for instance. I mean, I think they go perfectly well hand in hand. I'm so old that my son actually had gone to university in 3 different European member states. I think it's a scam he has for getting my money out of me. But at least when I see his generation, they are colorblind. They are blind to what the German gentleman said in our past, these stereotypes about other European nationalities. This has been broken down, but nobody explains it. We are not good enough to explain our progress in this. So I think that there has been a cultural integration which gives many more layers of identity to our citizens and the younger generations foremost. I might be sitting in my elitaire silo in Brussels, but I think there's also a positive development that no matter what policies the national member states come up with, you cannot avoid to come to a different place in the future.
Actually did want to...
I wasn't sure.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Just to your point, which is a really good one. I think, as always, we're talking about the kind of stubborn minorities. I mean, the majority of both immigrants and host communities have a kind of enlarged notion, or are prepared to accept an enlarged notion of national identity. However, there are stubborn minorities on both sides, that immigrants who don't want to integrate, and who actively resist, wanting to become westernized or British, and not taking the chance to learn English, and then host community segments that are racist, that will never accept anything other than an indigenous English person or British person. And so how do we get both of those groups to move forward together? Because it has to be that the host community sees that these groups of immigrants want to integrate, and the immigrants have to feel that host communities want to open them with open arms. And so how do you get both of these groups to move together? And I think one huge impediment to that is the media, especially in the UK. All these lurid headlines that they like to go out there. And, that it always, every single conference you go to, no matter what the policy area too, at least in the UK, it always comes down to the media. They're the ones who always are to blame. So how you influence that, not so sure. But, that's my response to that.
The media, influencing the media, forget it. It's not the British media, it's every media. Media is trying to sell newspapers. and crazy headlines and, pointing out to broken things, whether they're, really broken or not, is how they sell papers. I mean, I don't disagree with you. I'm just saying, on the issue of, your question really goes to the core of this issue. And from your own experience, since we're talking about Sweden specifically, that the most difficult thing that countries have to face is to adapt their history, their myths, because everybody has their own right to their own myths. Think of the myths that we create. I don't know if you live here now, that we create, in order to sort of continue to shore up, who we are, okay? So everybody has their own myths. They have a right to that. That's what, in a sense, is at the core of this identity matters. And the mistakes that many Europeans have committed in the past is basically catching up with them now, which is isolating ethnic communities for far too long. If you'd done this, we had, I'm not going to say who, but a senior member of your government here yesterday and the day before, who acknowledged, that as far as the government was concerned until the 1990s, the idea was that people like you, and I don't mean from, Eritrea, but people, all of these refugees who were coming here, were there temporarily, that circumstances would change and they were all going to go back, okay? To a certain degree, this was fairly common for several countries, not every country in the EU, but for several countries in the EU. What this meant is that you lost a 30-year period during which you could have started adapting your institutions, changing your laws, and creating more inclusive societies. So the catch-up becomes a little more difficult. They are conscious of the fact that they need to catch up. But the most difficult thing to do is change this self-perception of who we are. We're impatient because the problem is so deep and so urgent, okay? But from our side, people outside of the government, we need to keep pushing the envelope, particularly, the NGOs, civil society institutions. We need to keep pushing, to sort of constantly redefine the who we are in order to include everybody. And let's not forget that many of these countries, including your country, meaning Sweden, got to these accommodations that basically are reflected in how the government and society is organized today, after somebody said, not decades, centuries of killing each other. Okay? So whatever unique institutions they have created, they created them over a period of 200 and 300 years that basically led to something. And then just about as they thought that they had gotten it just about right, all of these immigrants come in. Darn it! And now they have to renegotiate everything. Social rights, economic rights, political rights. It's much easier to pretend that they're going to come and they're going to go, than say, guys, we have to rethink the whole thing. And here's where the EU, of course, has been nicely persistent. I love what Uffe said, As far as we're concerned, we keep pushing forward, okay? More, they have bosses too. It's called 27 member states.
I was going to say, actually, I don't want to delve into your private business, but do you hold a Swedish passport? Are you a Swedish citizen? Okay, because one of the things I also wanted to point out a little bit, too, was some of the language around that. And so I think it's interesting that people that are citizens, in some cases, are also still considering themselves migrants in these conversations around identity. And I wanted to highlight actually two things. So there's a theory on everyday racism that a professor from the Netherlands called Philomena Essed actually developed back in the 90s that actually talks about the othering process that takes place in Europe, from constant questions of where did you come from, people trying to touch your hair, et cetera, that actually takes place. And so even as we're talking about, I think, some of these macro and larger policies, there are also some kind of, I think, just day-to-day interactions that take place as well that communicate to people that they don't necessarily fit into the cultures. There are two other things that have been happening. So the U.S. State Department actually did a program on social cohesion in broadcasting to really talk about this media issue and how state-run programs can really think differently about how persons from diverse backgrounds are actually being produced in the media. And then secondly, just wanted to highlight, so French President Francis Hollande has appointed this quote-unquote diversity cabinet. So out of 34 cabinet members, 17 are female, 7 are migrants. And so then also in terms of changing images, perspectives, and national identity of, who we are, do these types of, changes in terms of leadership make a difference? And I think there have definitely been arguments on the U.S. side in terms of President Obama, Secretary Rice, Colin Powell, et cetera, that have actually led to some changes in our thinking. And so if there were other questions as well, if people wanted to start here and there.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, everybody. I don't think your two approaches are mutually exclusive, because I think John would the idea is that to understand and expand our notion of Britishness comes from working with other people, knowing them and learning to understand how they are, rather than a debate about what does it mean to be British, because that never takes us anywhere. And we've had hundreds of them, and they're just a big waste of money. But I had a point, two things, and whether you want to answer them or not, it's up to you. But the first is, in terms of two different cultures living side by side and not integrating, I think that rich and poor is actually probably a bigger one. That's far less integrated, that never come into contact with each other, but we don't see it because we don't have different coloured skin. So we don't think necessarily that it's a problem. But I think it really is, and it's interesting to see whether there's an intersection between those 2 points and whether you'd agree with that. And second is, there are systemic problems in society with the media. There's certain things that you can't really change with the media, with the required continued levels of high immigration, the tendency of homophily, of people to live together with people that look like them and act like them, that share the same background. Does that mean that nationalist, xenophobic parties are now just part of the landscape? And actually, the job is maybe to contain them. It's not really to reduce them, it's to live with them. It's to make sure that it doesn't get much worse. Or is it trying to push back against them? So the approach would be slightly different for each. So it's interesting on your...
Woman here in the red scarf.
Thank you very much. Susan Pierce, I'm a fellow here at the Wilson Center and a sociologist with East Carolina University. To end on a positive note, as you ask us to do, I think everyone in this room knows how women are animating migration at a global level now. They're independently migrating, they're migrating alone many times, and they're more highly educated than ever before. And so my question is, what do female migrants have to offer Europe?
No, actually, we'll take Rachel Neal as well.
I'll just come back to the age demographic question. I was really glad you brought it up because I'm having a senior moment. I can't remember what it was I read, but it was about support for radical right parties, and there were distinct differences, as I recall, with younger generations in Europe who weren't necessarily as supportive. I mean, there are enclaves who are the sort of neo-Nazi sympathizers, but if you take a broader spectrum, actually the next generations are growing up in diverse societies. As a matter of fact, they may be in segregated schools, but they're still in diverse societies. And how you factor that kind of slightly longer term perspective into your thinking about the far right and attitudinal shifts as well. And on the media side, I mean, one of the interesting things there, of course, is that they're not necessarily as wedded to the media that my generation, is familiar with print and TV. The internet, of course, is a diverse place on its own and fostering the radical right as much as it is other things. But are we doing enough to look at the kind of creative discourse there amongst young people and shaping of their own identities, especially given how well, despite language barriers, they seem to sort of pass over national barriers through youth culture movements?
I mean, I don't have much to say except what I said before, that my personal belief is very positive when I see the young people and the way they interact, and I think that my background from Denmark, as I said, has shown that those who were voting for the more foreign skeptic immigration policy. I mean, they are dying out. So today, I would imagine it's the same in the Netherlands. I mean, whatever the policies have been of the countries, I think there's a change, and the change comes by the fact that they are interacting in new ways. And as I said, the European Union, we cannot quantify it easily. I know if we can't count it, it doesn't count. But I still believe in the soft way of making exchange programs, of making the European Union available for young people and debate forums, etc. And just to come back to what I said before, I said that we in the European Commission is perhaps disconnected from reality, but I mean, we still have a lot of interaction with the NGOs, with the civil societies, with the member states, with the European Parliament. So whatever policy decisions we are going to do is done in a very broad consultations all the time.
And Jonathan.
Yeah, just very quickly on 2 points. I'm sorry I can't get to all of them. On Jamie's point, I know he knows what I'm going to say about what to do about populist parties, but I'm not sure anyone else does. So basically, I think, yes, that they are going to be kind of part of the landscape from now on. Hopefully, they're not going to get too much bigger, depending on what happens in Europe. Hopefully, the kind of doomsday scenario won't manifest. But I think it's important that we don't not push back against them. Obviously, you make an argument as to the importance of immigration and the need to expand the national identity, etc. But we also don't just completely dismiss them as racist offhand and try and ban them from the political process. Because as we, in our research, suggests that those who were more active offline as formal party members or voting or participating in street demonstrations were also more likely to be more positive in a number of other attitudinal characteristics. So it's not the ones that are getting active offline that we need to worry about. It's the ones that are too disillusioned to get active offline. So we need to increase the trust there. And then just on your social media point, I'm not sure if Jamie went into this, but I've also done research on this concept of digital literacy, because you're absolutely right. I mean, that's where young people get their media today. And so this concept of digital literacy, just how kind of critical are they about what type of information they receive on the internet? And actually, they're not. And so we think it's really important. We've developed this concept of digital fluency, and we're doing research on this. We're trying to promote this idea. And it's basically a combination of traditional critical thinking skills, trying to assess the quality of evidence, triangulating sources, in combination with specific knowledge about how the internet works. So search optimization, etc. Because a lot of young people just take the first thing they see that Google returns and believe it is truth. A lot of times they're influenced by the aesthetics of the website or video creation. So it's really important that, and obviously that makes them susceptible to extremist and populist type arguments. So we think this needs to be a core, critical thinking, especially more so than ever. Because of the amount of information that is available to us every single day, we need to know how to wade through that. Because you don't have the same kind of community of editors or peer reviewers that kind of monitor that and play that monitoring role. So I think that is really important, that concept.
I'll say 3 things about some of the questions and comments. I think Ufe's point about the next generation is a very important point. I mean, if there is one thing on which the EU, the Commission, has invested systematically, is on the next generation. It is a question, we'll find the answer in the next 15 years, whether that next generation is, which now, by all accounts, is more European than any other parts of their own countries, whether this is going to continue. And the challenge, of course, is going to be unemployment in the 30s, 40s, and 50%. In other words, let's not forget that most of the social sort of problems that get created in societies are also created by young people. Unemployed, without prospects, easily falling victims to all sorts of crazes, whether it's through the internet. The internet is past me, so I'm not going to say anything about it. And if we're going to lose that generation in Europe, we lost the game in Europe. And unlike perhaps some of you who may be optimistic, not about whether we're going to lose the generation, but how long this economic crisis and the fiscal elements of it are going to last, I am pessimistic. It's going to last for far longer. You know, an awful lot of people dismissed that in 2010, continue to do so in 11, certainly do in 12. The idea is that for the next 6 or 7 years, if we continue to mindlessly say more immigration is needed, and, you know, continue to do all of those things, then we could be digging a hole for ourselves, which brings me to a second point. Governments have been, you know, sort of, if not hard of hearing, if not deaf, certainly hard of hearing. And they've done so by continuing to open the doors and ignoring what is legitimate about the concerns of their people. I didn't say that what you hear from extremist parties and others is all legitimate, but I am saying that some of the things that are at the core of the concerns of people that then lead to votes in favor of extremist parties is because of this, you know, sort of inability of governments to actually listen. And how do you listen? It's not by stopping immigration, it's by investing in your own people. You had a conversation about the Romas. Look at what investments have been made, you know, in Romas. Virtually none. Other minorities, older people. This 1/3 or whatever the number of these people who, you know, are disaffected, etc. in the UK, I don't care, 20%. Governments need to invest in their people. And like professors, you like to invest in the smart kids in class. They like to invest in the people who are going to create and, you know, sort of give more oomph to a competitive economy. But really, the people that you must not forget are the people who are losers in this openness, whether it's globalization, whether it's more openness toward migration, etc. If you don't mind the losers, to use a British expression, minding, if you don't pay attention to what's legitimate about those people who lose out and do something about it, you're digging part of your own grave on this. On the populist and extremist parties themselves, we all know what the typology is, the three responses. The one is decertify them, like the Germans do every so often. In other words, find a reason. If they're violating the law, basically make them illegal. It doesn't mean that they're going to go away, and it doesn't mean that some of them are not going to go underground. Okay? But if they are breaking laws, you attack them. The second one is to certainly, you know, sort of put your energy behind the fact that democracy means that everybody has a right to their own vote. And expect them to be there and trying to always make certain, you know, that part of the agenda that they have that may be legitimate, you basically do what political parties have always done through the history of political parties. They just generously reach over and say, you know, that part of your agenda, I'll now make it mine. This way you isolate them further and further. And I think, you know, this is very important. The laissez-faire thing, you know, is the most dangerous. But again, at the end of the day, are you going to basically become anti-democratic, which is what you are accusing them of being, and try to do something extreme with the extremists? It's a big question. And on the issue of women, it's a fascinating point. You know, thank God there is always one person in every group that says, hello, have you forgotten us? We're the majority now in every country, and I'm on migrants. And we're not just following husbands and boyfriends. We're the ones who are migrating. And it's a great question. You know, we don't focus on it. Okay? You're the ones who internationally play the same roles that you play nationally. You take care of families, You're scientists, you're professors, you're all of the other things, and we keep ignoring you. But maybe, you're now big enough that you don't need to be paid special attention to. I don't know the answer, but I do appreciate the point.
We're actually at 3:30, and so unfortunately we had to end. I did want to note, though, that our discussion did primarily focus on the public sector. I think there was a point that was made earlier, specifically around Islamic banking, and how the private sector has also actually taken the lead on some of these issues. And so in a sense, the need or opportunity for business was what actually helped to lead to some of the changes in the public sector around some of these issues. Two, I guess, other things, Denmark was actually recently the host of what was called a Transatlantic Inclusion Leaders Conference that brought 70 diverse individuals from across Europe and the United States together to really talk about the demographic future and a commitment of these young people to inclusive governments. And so as everyone was talking about these far-right or extremist populist groups that are coming together on the web, I did want to note, and through social media, I did want to note that there's another group of people that are also coming together on the web that are really committed, I think, to these ideas of inclusion. And linked to that, for those of you who don't know, last year in August, President Obama actually issued an executive order on diversity and inclusion for the federal government workforce. And so each of the U.S. agencies are now in the process of putting together plans on diversity and inclusion for each of the workforces here. And again, this is something that I think people could really think about in terms of something that's very forward-looking, and possibly something that could also be considered elsewhere. And so we want to thank you so much for your time, thoughts on these topics, and hope that this won't actually be your last conversation here with us. Thank you.